so I was just down there welcoming them as well, and wanted to, again, thank you for coming. A little bit about the firm. We started like 40, 50 years ago now, and our model has always been to represent emerging growth companies and to help them from the earliest stages up through wherever they grow. And so everything we do is really geared toward supporting the ecosystem. And so hosting events like this is absolutely part of our role, and one that we really cherish. And we feel that if you can make connections, it doesn't always, turn out to be, a business thing, but it can be just more community. And being part of the community and being supportive of an ecosystem is important to us. It should be important to everybody. We have the luxury of being in the greatest cauldron of activity for startup companies in the world. And a lot of that has to do with mentors and investors and universities and giving, all of those people giving to the community. So, and one of the ways we give to the community is we publish a report. It's called the Entrepreneurs Report. So there's a stack of them up here, and we can hand them around for anybody who's interested. And it kind of goes through the dynamics of venture capital and what the latest terms are and financing and things. But it's really kind of, again, part of our giving back to this ecosystem. So welcome. With that, I'll hand it over to William Murphy.
Well, thank you very much. We really do appreciate the use of this wonderful facility. We've done it before, and we hope to do it a few more times. So I always start the program out with the defining question usually of any event is, where are the restrooms? And those are downstairs across the lobby to the other side.
Emergency exit.
Pardon?
Emergency exit.
Where is the emergency exit?
Oh, the emergency exit. We can't help you there.
Turn right and run.
The front door where you came in is probably about as close as it gets. Oh. Yes.
Restaurants are down.
The restrooms across the hallway, go down the stairs across the hallway to the other side. Follow the icons, I trust you. And the emergency exits, thanks for the other, are pretty much the way you came in. Hopefully, we won't need them. Getting on to the nice event, and thinking back a while, a number of years ago, Robert Lustig, who graduated from the Institute in 1977 in course 7, which is for you numerologists, and then went on to Cornell for his MD degree, and various internships and residencies around the country, including at one point, I think at Rockefeller University, which I guess was a postdoc position, and ended up at the University of San Francisco, where he specializes in childhood endocrinology. I would have said pediatric, but I can usually have difficulty pronouncing that, plus the word endocrinology, too many Greek words, suffixes. And we met years ago, actually. We won't stress how many years ago, but where Rob was doing one of these events where he was the event VP up at the University Club in San Francisco, sort of one of our gala events where we had George Keller, who was the chairman of the Chevron Corporation, and it was a festive occasion. So he has a little empathy for the speaker, for the host as well as the speakership. So the main thing we did a number of years ago, Bob has talked to our group before, which coincided, one of his talks was when the book his book on Fat Chance came out, which was a very popularly selling book. And we did an event, and a number of years ago I noticed he'd come out with a second book, so I invited him in to see whether he could talk on that, which is the hacking of the American mind. So it's interesting to see the connection between this. I sort of come to the conclusion from reading his books that we have less free will than we think. We're just organic robots. And our motivation is by our endocrinological system. So with that to do, let me turn it over to Rob Lustig.
Well, can everyone hear me, or is it turned on?
Not
Not
yet.
turned on yet? How about now?
Yes.
Now? All right, good. Well, thank you, Bill. Yeah, Bill and I go back quite a ways, as he mentioned, and I've always been so pleased and delighted with not just his good demeanor, but the fact that he gets it until today. Didn't you learn anything from Fat Chance? What's the soda doing back there?
I looked at that and I said we failed. I don't think anybody drank my notes.
Good.
I certainly didn't.
Good. That should be the first thing to go. All right.
All the food was quite
Yes, the food was fine. Let me get this thing moving here. Okay, very good. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Perfect. So first of all, thank the club for the invitation. I always love talking to you guys because we are us, and there's a great bond. And people keep asking me, when's this from? And this is my prized possession. It never goes off. And I hope you all feel the same way. To me, being an MIT alum is perhaps my greatest triumph in life, and I hope you all feel the same way. The other thing I want to say is I am really, really pleased that this talk is today and not tomorrow. Because as I was coming up here, my colleague said break a leg, and I said, no, that's what Durant did. So I don't want that. All right, well, I think I'm safe. So how many of you are parents? How many of you are kids? So that's everybody. Okay, good. Got the right audience. In case you haven't noticed, things have changed a little bit. And the question is, for the better or for the worse? And I think that's an open question. And I hope today will help solve that question for you. My issue with this started in 2007. So I was head of the pediatric obesity clinic at UCSF from 2001 till I clinically retired in 2017. And all was going well. And, I would see obese kids in clinic, and invariably the obese kids would come with an obese mother who would also come with obese sibs to boot. And they would all come to the clinic, and usually there wasn't even enough room for me in the room. But, the kids were fighting with each other and, blowing up the gloves, and playing with the tongue depressors and invariably falling off the exam table and, generally causing kid ruckus, because that's what kids do. And then in 2007, something happened. For the first time, mother wheeled her 15-month-old in with an iPad. And this kid was really good at it. Knew how to play all these games. He's 15 months old. And I was able to actually have a conversation with this mom. And I thought, this is fantastic. This is wonderful. And of course, and then the second kid came in and couldn't do it. And the third kid, I was thinking maybe this wasn't so good. Maybe there was a problem. And in fact, my concern in 2007 has been, realized. And as I had researched my work on sugar and addiction, it became very clear that we had a similar problem. And I'm going to try to explain that to you today. So, first of all, who thinks this is a good idea? It's 4G. So it says. Maybe it is, I don't know, maybe it is a good idea. I'm still not sure.
Teachers learn to press buttons.
Well, you learn how to press buttons. So the
They
question
learn
is
to
that?
dial like I did.
Yeah, so the question is that good or bad? That you learn
When
how to press
mankind,
buttons.
when mankind created tools, they were sharp and dangerous, but
We learned how to use tools, right? Okay. That's where we're going. That's exactly where we're going.
Is this a printed version or is this an actual version they can use? Because if it's a fake version, you know.
Well, let's put it this way, it's not connected to the internet. Okay? But it is a version you can use, it's just not connected to the internet. So, the other title to this talk, aside from the hacking the American child, is the following. So it's not working. Oh, that's fine. Hold on. What do you call it, came up? The Wi-Fi. So, okay. So the, what do you call it? It's not, let me take this out. Try it out. It's not advanced. There we go. That's the other title. Okay. Welcome to the dark side of the force. So, I do have a couple of disclosures. I did write these books for the general public. I am the chief science officer of a nonprofit here in the Bay Area called Eat Real, where we praise the good. We award a trust mark, like LEED certification for buildings or fair trade, something people want to see, to restaurants, medical centers, cafeterias, hospitals, school districts that procure, market, and sell real food, trying to fix the problem from the bottom up. So if you go to a restaurant and you see this green fork in the window, it means that if you eat there, it will not kill you, which is kind of a good thing to know. Okay. I'm also now the resigned CMO of a for-profit startup, and if anybody wants to learn more about it, because there are probably some investors in the room, we are trying to develop a bioengineered method for dealing with the metabolic syndrome pandemic worldwide. And I can explain that later if you want. So, this is an interesting quote. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. And look who said it. Okay? And this was said a while ago, before the recent spate of toxic events, if you will. So, we're here to talk about technology, and after all, this is the MIT Club of Northern California. We know something about technology, and what we know is that technology is a tool. Okay, like all of us, we are all tools, right? Okay, so, you can use tools for good, or you can use tools for bad, right? A hammer. You can hammer a nail, or you can hammer a skull. Depends on the user, and depends on what you do with it. So this is not a discussion of whether technology is good or bad. That's not what this is. Okay? Clearly, it is both good and bad. Problem is, you only usually get to hear about the good. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about the bad, so that you have, shall we say, an even balance in your head going forward. And you can understand what all the hubbub in D.C. and around the world is about. Okay? So, we are going to talk about technology. We're going to talk about all of technology. That is, computers, phones, internet, social media, and unfortunately, some not so savory side effects. So, as you know, there are lots of upsides to technology, but here are the downsides. So problems with attention, cognition, memory, and learning. And it's very possible that video games are actually making that worse. In fact, there's lots of data to support that. Somehow this is actually rewiring the brain to be actually problematic in terms of being able to concentrate, being able to perform standard functions in school. So is that a good thing? Reading and critical thinking. Scientific method is going out the window, in part because people are looking things up instead of deriving. Exposure to unwanted or inappropriate content, I don't think I have to explain that to parents. Multitasking, interruptions, and stress. Turns out multitasking is basically the most evil word in the English language. You can't get a job if you don't multitask. However, only 2.5% of the population can actually do it. The rest of us, it's smoke and mirrors. We're serially unitasking. The problem is, every time we switch from one task to another, we get a cortisol bump, which fries neurons, and we lose 23 minutes of concentration as we readapt to the next event, the next function.
Are you gonna tell us about the data behind that?
I wasn't, but I can. Right? I mean, there's good data on that. It's in the book.
Okay.
It's in the book. Okay. I mean, if I start going into, the whys and wherefores, I mean, I'll have to switch, screens and stuff, and we'll never get through this. But if you want later, we can, discuss. Problems with stimulation and self-regulation, depression and emotional well-being, which we're going to talk a lot about that. Problems with empathy. So college students who have one of these in their pockets are 40% less empathic than college students who don't at any given moment. Problems with sleep, and that's not just because of the content, but because of the blue screens, activating the pineal gland and basically keeping you up because you don't know that the lights have gone off. Children who sleep with their cell phone charging in their room get 28 minutes less sleep per night than children whose cell phones charge in another room, as an example. Loneliness, big issue. Distracted driving, distracted pedestrians. My next door neighbor is Matt Richtel, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, reporter for the New York Times, who wrote a whole book called, what's it called again? A Deadly Reckoning, about a 19-year-old who was texting and driving in Utah and killed 2 NASA astrophysicists, and is responsible now for many of the texting and walking laws around the country. Cyberbullying, again, I don't think I need to explain what that is. Parent stress, I think we're all feeling it right now. And finally, hacking the mind. That is, introducing thoughts that you didn't necessarily know you had, and probably wouldn't have had your mind not been hacked. So hate speech, election interference, and really the thing that's on the verge is artificial intelligence. And, we're seeing it to some extent already, but we haven't yet figured out the bad side. It's coming. I promise it's coming. So all of these downsides use the same 3 neural pathways in the brain. You have to understand what these do in order to be able to understand how these work and therefore how to combat it. So we're going to spend just a moment on neuroscience as I explain these 3 pathways. They are the reward pathway, and all rewards go through the same pathway, and I will show it to you. The contentment pathway, which is the happiness pathway, which is a different pathway than the reward pathway, completely different. And finally, the stress-fear memory pathway. These are all parts of a part of the brain called the limbic system. Okay, some people call it the lizard brain. Okay, it's the original part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that all vertebrates have. Okay, that's a construct across species, but we're going to talk about what makes us human and how that part is actually undergoing dysfunction. So, the reward pathway. As you can see, let me see if I can get this into it. Yeah, there we go. So, the dopamine neurons. Dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter. It is also the learning neurotransmitter. It is the reinforcement neurotransmitter. Basically, when dopamine is released, your brain says, hey, this feels good. I want more. That's what dopamine does. And whatever signals that dopamine release, that's what you get out of it. And there are chemicals that can make it happen, and there are behaviors that can make it happen. We're going to talk about both. Anyway, this is the site of those dopamine neurons, the ventral tegmental area. This is where they start. And then they project to 2 places. This area here called the nucleus accumbens, also known as the reward center. So when anybody is ever talking about the reward center, whether it be in relation to addiction or any kind of reward, that's the part of the brain they're talking about, the reward center. And that's where the dopamine receptors are. So the dopamine gets released, the receptors bind it, and then you transduce that signal into one of reward. Everybody got that? In addition, that area projects to this part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain right behind your forehead, which turns out is what this whole talk is really about, is the dysfunctions of the prefrontal cortex, as you will see. This area of the brain is the Jimmy Cricket part of your brain. It is the part of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. It is the part of your brain that sees the future, that interprets the consequences of your actions before you act. Therefore, it is the part of your brain that makes you human. And it is the part of your brain that the rest of the species do not have, but we do. And what you can see is that the reward center goes and projects to that area as well. And actually, the prefrontal cortex projects back in a servo mechanism to try to keep the lid under control when it's working. Problem is, it's not always working. Now, the next part is the contentment pathway, or the happiness pathway. And as you can see, that is a completely different pathway, not the same. The area of the brain is called the dorsal raphe. Remember before it was the ventral tegmental area. And it releases a different neurotransmitter called serotonin. You've heard of serotonin, yes? Like SSRIs, like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? Exactly. Antidepressants, because when you have serotonin in your synapse, you feel contentment, you feel better, you feel at one with the world. And in fact, all of these mindfulness tricks and various things that we do to try to improve our lives, and improve our mental health, are all serotonin generating. Now, this area, the dorsal raphe, projects throughout the entire cortex, also to the prefrontal cortex as well. And lastly, we have the stress-fear memory pathway. So, again, the prefrontal cortex plays a huge role in this because it's tamping down on this pathway in a big way. So, the seat of fear is right here, the amygdala. When you walk down a deserted alley at 3 in the morning, whether there's someone there or not, you have that feeling of dread. Okay? Not because there's anyone there, but because there isn't. Okay? Everybody knows what I'm talking about. Right? That is your amygdala going off hog wild, brake guns. It is your prefrontal cortex that says, don't worry, I don't see anyone there. You can make it across, and it'll be fine. Okay? So it tamps down by applying rationality to the situation. In addition, we have the hippocampus. You've heard that one probably as well. That's the part of your brain that remembers stuff. That's the memory center. That's where the memory of your putting your hand down on a hot stove when you were 3 years old is stored. And of course, you learned not to do that again. Okay? Because the hippocampus is working. When the hippocampus is not working, that's called Alzheimer's disease. Okay? And lastly, we have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the seat of all hormonal regulation. So when the amygdala goes off, it tells the hypothalamus, I'm in a stressful, fearful situation. Release the hormone cortisol. And cortisol is your stress hormone, your chronic stress hormone. And it's the thing that raises your blood glucose, it raises your blood pressure, and it helps you get through whatever the stress is until the stress goes away, and then cortisol goes back down. The problem is cortisol also feeds back on that prefrontal cortex and tells it to go to sleep. Because when you're stressed, you don't want to be thinking about tomorrow. You want to be thinking about today. So this is also a servo mechanism to try to keep you focused on what's important for the moment. So when you're stressed, there's nothing except right now. In order for your prefrontal cortex to work, you have to be not stressed. Everybody with me so far? And all this makes some sense to you in a grand sort of way? So this is the model. When you actually put all the data together, this is what's happening. In this box here, this black box, are the 5 things that have happened to our society over the last 50 years. Technology, that's what we're talking about today. Processed food, sugar, sleep deprivation, and drugs. We could have an hour talk on each one of these. Today we're just doing technology. What these all do is they raise dopamine. They're all dopamine stimulants. And so what happens? You get a reward. So all of these are rewarding at least acutely, in their own right. The problem is Dopamine is a double-edged sword. It's good, but it's also bad. And I'll show you in a moment why it's bad. In order to prevent cell death in the brain, dopamine is the cause of the cell death, and I'll show you why in a minute. The neurons that have the dopamine receptors that are binding that dopamine, they don't want to die. And so what they do is they downregulate the dopamine receptor in an attempt to try to, again, do a servo mechanism kind of thing, to try to keep things on an even keel. What this means, though, is you have to get more and more of the stimulant, whatever it is, to derive less and less reward. And this is the phenomenon we call tolerance. Now throw some stress on it, some cortisol. And what happens is that prefrontal cortex, which is keeping things tamped down, goes to sleep. And the combination of dopamine plus stress, that's what leads to addiction in all cases. And the data show it. On the other side, every one of these 5 things also contributes to bad health in the form of chronic metabolic disease, what we call metabolic syndrome, which is the constellation of diseases: type 2 diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease. These are all diseases which were rare before 1970, and now 50% of the population has them. So they've gone from rare to basically everyone in a very short period of time. And all of these contribute to this problem of metabolic syndrome. It turns out all the disease of metabolic syndrome lowers serotonin. So you become less happy. Then throw some stress on, which reduces the receptor for serotonin, called the serotonin 1A receptor. Now you have less stimulant, you have fewer receptors, and now you have depression. So addiction and depression are actually 2 sides of the same coin, driven by the same 5 things that have become omnipresent in our society. Now it was my job to show you that the data for the model are there and what that ultimately implies for our society. That's what the rest of this talk is about. But remember this pathway. Okay? So here are the 5 questions that we're going to discuss and answer today. Is there such a thing as technology addiction? Is that the same as drug addiction? And why? Does technology lead to depression? Have our minds been hacked? And are children at more risk? So I'm going to start with the last question first, because it's the easiest one to explain. Children are at more risk for everything. Impulse control disorders, substance use disorders, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, schizophrenia, and you'll notice it happens in puberty. And there's a reason it happens in puberty. All mental health problems exacerbate at puberty. And there's a boatload of reasons, some of them having to do with genetics, some of them having to do with stress, but most of them having to do with the fact that this area here, the prefrontal cortex, which tamps down on all of these problems, is being damaged. And that's when it's being damaged. And I'll show you that. Okay. So you'll notice that there is a peak of addiction in the pubertal age group right here. You'll notice that things that we associate with chronic stress in children, so what we call adverse childhood events, or ACEs, so child abuse, divorce, sex abuse, etc. Okay. The more abuses, the more ACEs, the more risk for alcoholism and illicit drug use later. So what happens to you during childhood manifests itself later on as mental health disorders. How about depression? So this is particularly worrisome. Here we're looking at all pediatric emergency department visits for the entire country over the years of the iPhone, from 2007 to 2015. And you'll notice it's pretty stable. However, when you take it apart and look specifically at those that were for self-abuse or self-injury or self-harm, look how high those were. And if you look at outpatient encounters in clinic with suicidal ideation or self-harm, they've tripled in the years of the iPhone. What about mortality? So here we're looking at children ages 10 to 14. And And what you'll notice from 1999 to 2014 is that motor vehicle accident deaths have been cut in half. So that's because we have better cars, we have crumple zones, etc. We have, seat belts and helmets and what have you. But really, that's not the reason. The reason is because kids aren't in cars. Where are they? They're in their rooms playing video games, and suicide is now more common in the 10 to 14-year-old age group than motor vehicle accidents. Now, how do you explain that? In fact, it's not just 10 to 14-year-olds. Suicide rates are up 30% all over the country. And of those, only half were known to have a mental health problem. So this is happening in people that weren't diagnosed with depression or schizophrenia. So this is a huge issue. And you hear about it all the time on TV. In fact, antidepressant use is way up. So that's those selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But it's not just an American problem. This is going on all over the world. 322 million people globally, 4.4% of the entire world's population, now carries a diagnosis of endogenous depression. And this is not selection bias. This is, been worked out very successfully. And it is an 18.5% increase in prevalence in the years of the iPhone. So this is a huge problem. So why does this happen? Well, again, it has to do with this area of the brain that we're talking about, the prefrontal cortex. So I want you to take a look here. Here are different species. And you can see the prefrontal cortex is 2/3 of the front of the brain in humans, whereas other animals, not so much. And that's why animals are animals. That's why they can't see the future. That's why they can't figure out what bad behavior is. They just engage in it anyway. Okay, we're supposed to know, right? But we're not. Now, how do we know this? Well, here are the skulls of our ancestors working our way up to Homo sapiens. And you'll notice the rest of the brain's about the same. It's only the prefrontal cortex that keeps expanding. So this is the newest part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that has evolved most recently. And so what does it do? Well, it does a bunch of things. It considers the future. The future makes predictions. It focuses our attention. It organizes our thoughts and problem solves. It forms strategy and planning. It inhibits inappropriate behavior, initiates appropriate behavior, something I've not seen very much of lately. Simultaneously considers multiple streams of information. Okay, so this whole multi versus unitasking, foreseeing and weighing possible consequences of behavior, shifting and adjusting behavior when situations change, adaptation, modulation of intense emotion so that you don't, go off like a volcano, impulse control and delayed gratification. When was the last time you heard that's talked about? Delayed gratification. Ability to balance short-term rewards with long-term goals. And that's ultimately what we're talking about, is the lack of the ability to see past right now. Yeah.
Are these known because people have been studied that are lacking that part of the brain? Or?
Yeah, because they've been damaged. So they study people who had damage to their prefrontal cortex to determine what has changed. There's a very famous case, Uriah Pike from the 1800s. He had a metal spike go through his head, okay, and he was a different person afterwards. In fact, people who've had concussions are different people afterwards for the same reason, because they've damaged their prefrontal cortex. So this is on a loop, so we'll continue to play for you. But basically what we're looking at here is the myelination of the prefrontal cortex. Remember I said it's the last part of the brain to develop evolutionarily. It's also the last part of the brain to develop physiologically in each individual. And it finishes when you're 25 years old. So it's going on all the way through puberty, all the way through young adulthood, and finally finishes around age 25. Which of course is why the actuaries lower the insurance rates on motor vehicles after age 25, because they've got the empiric data that says that after age 25, people start driving like people instead of like lunatics. Because basically before age 25, you're immortal. You don't know that you're gonna die, which of course is why we start conscription in, for the Army at age 18. Get them before they know that they're gonna die. And there's truth to that, and I know there's truth to that because the generals have told me so. Okay, not like Trump. He tells the generals, and the generals told me. Okay. Point is, this area of the brain, this prefrontal cortex, is the last part of the brain to develop. So it is the most susceptible to damage. So who here is an electrical engineer? Oh, God. Of course. All right, so here's my question to you. All right? You have a battery, a 240 volt battery. It's got two nodes, positive and negative. And you have two wires. They're equal copper, they're equal width, they're equal length. The only difference between the two wires is one's a bare wire and the other one's an insulated wire. You put either wire across the 240 volt battery nodes. Which wire is going to fry first? The bare wire or the insulated wire? Sorry? The bare wire. The bare wire is going to fry first. And the reason is Ohm's law. Okay? V equals IR, I equals V over R. The insulated wire has resistance. That's what the insulation gives you, is resistance. And so the insulated wire, the voltage is going to be the same because the battery is 240 volts, but the resistance goes up, which means the amperage goes down. It's the amperage that basically fries the wire. And you know this is true, for those of you who got it wrong, you know this is true because that's what a fuse box was. That's what fuses were. They were bare wires that you remember fuse boxes? Some of you, maybe? Okay, before circuit breakers, yeah. Okay. It was a bare wire that basically there was a power surge, and so the amperage went up. The wire would fry before your house did, and then you would replace the fuse. So the point is that the resistance that was afforded by the insulation prevented the frying of the wire. Well, guess what? The myelination that I just showed you on that previous slide that occurs late is protecting the brain from all sorts of chemical and electrical insults. The problem is it doesn't finish in the prefrontal cortex until you're 25 years old. So pubertal children are particularly at risk. Children are at risk for everything, but they are particularly at risk for this. Everybody with me so far? Any questions about this? So now, yeah.
Prefrontal cortex, is that just one area or is it differentiated because it has a
Oh.
lot of functions?
That's right, it does. And to some extent, there is a little bit of differentiation. So there is the VL PFC, the the dorsolateral PFC, which does one thing and the ventromedial does another. And yes, there is, but we can talk about it as one whole for today's purposes. Okay, but yes, you're absolutely right. So now I'm going to take you back to your childhood, many of you. Okay, and I'm going to play for you a public service announcement that ran on TV a lot. Okay, and you'll remember it as soon as you hear it. You will remember it. Wait. Where is it?
Okay, last time. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
So I'm sorry, I didn't think there was any questions. Everybody remember that? Okay. It was very effective, wasn't it? The question is, was it true? Yes or no? Turns out, not entirely. Sort of true, but not quite. Turns out, not every drug fires neurons. Those drugs that inhibit firing don't fry neurons. Only drugs that excite, that stimulate, fry neurons. Drugs that inhibit neurons, like benzodiazepines, do not fry neurons. Drugs like serotonin agonists, turned out, do not fry neurons. Psychedelics do not fry neurons. And back in 1970, when we had the Drug Enforcement Act, that basically made all psychedelics Schedule 1. Everybody remember? We didn't end up with a whole host of people showing up in emergency rooms because they didn't have downregulation of their serotonin receptor because it inhibited rather than stimulated. As it turns out, psychedelics are making a comeback. You may have read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. There's a whole chapter in my book, basically it's called Picking the Lock to Nirvana. You know, basically all about psychedelics and how serotonin works and why serotonin is inhibitory, therefore it doesn't damage the brain. Who'd have thunk it? Okay. So what does damage the brain? Well, excitatory drugs lead to cell death. So cocaine, ecstasy, meth, PCP, okay, we know those. Okay. And unmyelinated neurons are the most likely to die from chronic excitation. So, for instance, adolescent PFCs. So that's really the target. And this is basically how, here's your adolescent brain under construction. You know, if you're not doing myelinogenesis and you get some changes, you're basically going to alter your prefrontal cortex. Now, of particular note is that cannabis, which is now legal, delays myelinization. It delays myelinization. So if you've already myelinated your brain, that is, if you're over 25, cannabis is a recreational drug, and it is now approved for recreational use here in California. If you are under 25, cannabis is inhibiting your prefrontal cortical maturation and rendering you more susceptible to other excitations. And so, chronic cannabis users in puberty lose 8 IQ points compared to the controls. So my question to you is, was it a good idea to legalize cannabis? I don't know, but maybe you should think about it. In fact, we have the data to show that decreased myelinization, for instance, in the nucleus accumbens, leads to depression. And it's very specific to the nucleus accumbens, because when you do the multivariate linear regression analysis, that's the only part of the brain that shows up, and it's showing demyelinization. So here's the reason. Dopamine is excitatory. It excites the next neuron always. Okay? It is not an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, always. Well, long-term firing of neurons leads to neuronal cell death. Neurons like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Chronic overstimulation of any neuron will lead to neuronal cell death. And the reason we know this is because we have all these kids in the neurointensive care unit who have status epilepticus, you know, chronic seizure disorders, and we have to sometimes put these kids into pentobarbital coma to stop that excitation while we try to get hold of the seizure focus, because the longer they seize, the dumber they get, because we've basically allowed their brain to fry. So we know that this is not a good thing, this chronic excitation. Neurons like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Now, to protect themselves, these receiving neurons, the dopamine receptor positive neurons, they have a plan B. They have a self-defense mechanism. What they do is they downregulate the dopamine receptor on their surface so that it's less likely that any given dopamine molecule will find a receptor to bind to cause that neuron to fire. So this is basically a servo mechanism to try to limit the damage. And we have a name for this. It's called tolerance. More and more for less and less. So how does it work? Well, in human terms, you get a hit, you get a rush, receptors go down. Next time you need a bigger hit to get the same rush, and the receptors go down, and then a bigger hit, and a bigger hit, and a bigger hit, until finally you need a huge hit to get nothing. That's called tolerance. And then, when the neurons actually do start to die, that's called addiction. Everybody got it? That's what we're talking about, we're dealing with. So, here's dopamine receptors in it's a PET scan, where we're visualizing the dopamine receptors with radioactivity. And you can see here's a control brain, and wherever it's red, that means there are lots of dopamine receptors. And here's an addicted brain. And it doesn't matter if it's cocaine, meth, alcohol, heroin, it's all the same. Downregulation of the receptors. Everybody see that? And it turns out that is true in obesity as well. So obese people have fewer dopamine receptors. You can see there's it's called the scatter plot, which shows that the receptors are, there are fewer of them. All right, everybody got it? And the question is, why would that be? Okay.
Repeat, the downloading, it turns out.
The down regulation. So more dopamine means fewer receptors. So you need more and more to get less and less.
Are the receptors still there?
No, they're not. They can come back as long as the neuron's not dead yet. But once the neuron's dead, it ain't coming back. Those neurons do not regrow. Very few neurons regrow, and those do not. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why when someone enters rehab for addiction, let's say for like cocaine or heroin addiction, right? And they have to dry out, and they're in for several weeks at a time, and they come out, and they feel lousy because their dopamine receptors are still way down. And so some of them, in order to get that high again, will then use their heroin or whatever their drug of choice is at the same dose they left off at before. And now that's too much. And that's why you keep reading about all these celebrity deaths, like Heath Ledger, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Amy Winehouse, etc. It's because they went back to the same dose they started at, that they left off at before they went into rehab. It's a disaster. Yeah.
So food makes dopamine, coming back to
Yes.
the question.
Well, so what food? Thank you for asking.
Oh, sugar.
Okay. What food releases dopamine? Does all food release dopamine?
A little.
And that wasn't me who said this, it was National Geographic. Why we can't resist it. In fact, because sugar is addictive, and we have the data to show it now. That it is addictive. And the reason is because it stimulates dopamine. Well, everything that stimulates dopamine in the extreme is addictive. So it can be chemicals, cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, or it can also be behaviors. Shopping, gambling, internet gaming, social media, pornography. There's an aholic after every one of those. Shopaholic, sexaholic, chocoholic, alcoholic, etc., etc. You got the picture? So all dopamine releasers in the extreme lead to addiction. And that is true for technology as well. So here we are with our model again. And I hope I've explained why the model works. Here are our 5 changes in our society. Today we're focused on technology. Okay, now I'm going to show you my favorite Dilbert cartoon of all time. Who here likes Dilbert? Oh, of course, come on. It's like the ultimate MIT cartoon, right? The MRI shows that your brain has been hijacked by dopamine pirates. You are now under the full control of social media corporations, gambling casinos, and big pharma. Are you writing me a prescription? No, I'm buying stock in this company. Very Silicon Valley. Okay? In fact, that's exactly what's going on. Okay? I love this cartoon. So, addictive behaviors, technology as an addictive behavior. So do behaviors meet the criteria for addiction? Well, gambling does. Gambling is not a chemical, it's a behavior. And we all agree that there's this thing called gambling addiction. And it's been certified by the American Psychiatric Association, who's the referee for addiction, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual number 5 that came out in 2013. Before 2013, it was not an addiction, but in 2013 it was, and we have to talk about that. Yeah.
Just so I understand, when you say technology, you're talking about technology being used to deliver information and entertainment to us, or do you mean just?
I'm talking about internet gaming and social media primarily. Okay, there are plenty of ways that technology is involved in information transfer,
It's an upside, yeah.
which is the upside.
Yeah, like telephone calls and things like
Yeah,
that.
and genetic analysis and all the things we do at UCSF, for instance. Okay, because not addictive, okay? It's painful, it's cortisol, but it's not addiction. So, can behaviors meet the criteria for addiction? The answer is yes, now, but not always. This came in BBC. I ignored my children to play video games. In fact, 4 children have died in South Korea because the parents were addicted to their video games and neglected their children. Video game disorder in South Korea is a very real phenomenon. And when you look at the brain of people with internet gaming disorder, functional MRI, it's the same areas. It's the same dopamine area. Here's the PET scan, which is even better than the functional MRI, because there's the nucleus accumbens. Lighten up like, a wildfire. And guess what? It's not just internet gaming disorder, because the correlation of that fMRI activation and that nucleus accumbens also correlates with Facebook addiction scores. So you can be addicted to Facebook. So this came out a couple of months ago in the New York Times. It says, do not disturb how I ditched my phone and unbroke my brain. Indeed, he's got that right, but he said something else which I don't agree with. And I want to explain it because you're probably thinking the same thing. Here's what he said. I don't love referring to what we have as an addiction. So what he says. Unlike alcohol or opioids, phones aren't an addictive substance so much as a species-level environmental shock. That's what Kevin Rush says in this article. So the question is he right or is he wrong? He wrote it in the New York Times. Does that mean it's fake news? I don't know, maybe. So, every 20 years, the American Psychiatric Association holds its DSM conferences in order to basically rewrite the textbook of addiction. They do this every 20 years. So in 1993, this was the DSM-4, you had to meet 2 criteria for addiction. Tolerance, which we've explained more and more for less and less, and withdrawal. Tolerance and withdrawal. And withdrawal were systemic effects, that is, total body effects, not just brain effects, that occurred in response to abstinence. Now, all those chemicals, they go everywhere. They don't just go to the brain, they go throughout the entire body. They go to the GI tract, and they go to the skin, and they go to the eyelids, and they go to all sorts of places. So, when you look at withdrawal from any one of these chemicals, so here's caffeine, here's alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, heroin, you can see and you can feel what happens when you're abstinent. Who here has ever gone off caffeine? Sucks. Okay? And if you take my Starbucks away from me, I will kill you. All right? It feels lousy for at least a week. Right? That is withdrawal. Caffeine withdrawal. Caffeine is addictive. It is the model addictive substance. The only reason why it's still around is because we haven't yet figured out that it's toxic. Once it's toxic, I'm going to friggin' blow my brains out. Okay? And so will you, likely. Okay? The point is that all of these effects that we associate with withdrawal are all systemic effects. Now, obviously, behaviors don't have systemic effects because they're not chemicals. They didn't go everywhere else. They're only in the brain. So does that mean it's not addiction because there's no withdrawal? So in 2013, the APA, in its infinite wisdom, they were under pressure from the federal government to make gambling an addiction because we had to provide rehab services and they had to be paid for by insurance companies. And insurance companies would not pay for it unless we could cite that it was addictive. So there were political forces at work, but they actually analyzed the data and said, you know what? In fact, that's right. Gambling is addictive. It really is. Okay? And the reason is not because of withdrawal, but because of what they now termed dependence. Tolerance and dependence is now criteria for addiction. It can be tolerance and withdrawal for chemicals. It can be tolerance and dependence for behaviors. And this is the list of dependence behaviors. Craving, strong desire, result in fulfill major obligations. You can read them. Bottom line, that's Facebook. That's Facebook. Okay, it's internet gaming. It's all of these. So, in fact, definition right in the first place. Who says they got it right now? I don't know, it's a definition. Point is, right now it is addictive. And in fact, the World Health Organization has agreed, because in their ICD-11, they list gambling disorder, gaming disorder, and then other specified disorders due to addictive behaviors, and other unspecified disorders due to addictive behaviors. That includes Facebook, social media, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Now, it is true that America, the APA, has certified gambling and has only listed even a gaming disorder in the appendix as warranting further study. That is true. So in America, it's not addictive, but in Europe, it is addictive. Okay, like, how dumb is that, people? All right, you get the picture? So this is all about semantics. But the fact of the matter is we have the data, and the data are clear. In fact, the gaming industry went to the WHO and said, hold your fire on calling it gaming disorder. 2 weeks ago, the WHO said, nope, it's addiction. They've had lots of time to figure it out. So the question is, how do addictions develop? And how are addictions different from standard habits? Anybody read the book, Power of Habit? Okay. So we all have habits. Like, why do you put the toilet paper on one direction, not the other? Right? When you cross your arms, why do you go this way and not this way? Okay? These are all habits. Okay? They're non-dangerous habits, but they're habits. And the question is like, why didn't you start doing it the other way in the first place? Well, usually there's some sort of reward involved. Okay? What that reward might be, maybe deep and dark, sometimes we don't know. Let me give you an example. Head picking. Okay? So head picking is a habit. It's a filthy, nasty habit, but it's a habit. So how can something that's as filthy and nasty as head picking be rewarding? And the answer is because when you pick your head, if you're a head picker, okay, what you're doing is you're alleviating chronic stress for the moment. You're distracting yourself from the chronic stress. So even though it looks ridiculous, it is in fact inherently rewarding, and therefore reinforce it because you are getting a dopamine rise from the head picking. And that's why these habits are so hard to break, is because there's an inherent reward involved. So the way habits work is you have a trigger, which for lack of a better word we call the itch, which then leads to an action, which for lack of a better word we will call the scratch. And that then yields some form of inherent reward in whatever case habits are. So the question is, all right, so how does that lead to addiction? And the answer is, you have to change one piece. You change reward to variable reward. The reward's not the same every time. So like, for instance, a slot machine is not the same every time. Maybe you get a reward, maybe you don't. So it is that stress of wondering what's going to happen that actually then promotes that dopamine stress addiction paradigm that we talked about before, is the variability in the reward. So this, my friends, is a slot machine. If you didn't know it already, let me be the first to tell you, it is a slot machine. Okay. In fact, this was written by Nellie Bowles from the New York Times. The dark consensus about screens and kids begins to emerge in Silicon Valley. I am convinced the devil lives in our phones. Okay, there's some truth to that. And we know that that's true because they say so. Okay? Nothing like catching them in their own words. Yeah, please.
No, exactly.
Exactly, right. You gotta catch them in their own words. Okay? Like, Trump. You gotta catch them in their own words, or like Russia, whatever. Okay? This is from Sean Parker again. Here's what he said. He said, okay, he described a system of users posting content receiving likes as a social validation feedback loop exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. We sort of need to give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or post or whatever. He knew. He knew. And he said at the beginning, that was what we led with, right? God knows what it's doing to our children's brains. In fact, in Los Angeles, there is a company called Dopamine Labs. do is they will take your app and they will make it addictive. And the way they do it is they introduce variable reward. They gamify it. So all these people who are gamifying things, that's what they're doing. They're introducing variable reward. So the question is that a good thing? So again, here's our model. Okay. You can see how this works now. Dopamine plus stress, that's what equals addiction. So dopamine alone, that equals habit. Dopamine plus stress, that equals addiction. So you gotta have the inherent stress. Well, here's the stress. And it can be weaponized. And so, how did it get weaponized? With that weaponized. So, everybody knows the story of Facebook. Everybody watches social network. Everybody, been reading Axios lately. What happened? Oh, there we go. You know what I'm talking about. So, the fact of the matter is that before 2006, Facebook was doing okay, but not great. And in 2006, Justin Rosenstein introduced the like button. And it went viral, as they say. It went hog wild. And what it did was it basically brought people in via variable reward to worrying about their likes, worrying about what other people were saying about them, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really to the point. This was a study conducted by Tristan Harris, who's the head of the Center for Humane Technology, using an app called Moment, which monitors your app use. And what they figured out was the happy apps and the unhappy apps. So on the left, we have all the happy apps. Calm, Google Calendar, Headspace, Insight Timer, the weather, MyFitnessPal, Audible, Waze, Amazon Music, Podcasts, Kindle, Evernote, Spotify, Weather, Canvas. Those are the happy apps. What single thing ties those happy apps together?
Pure information.
Sorry?
Pure information.
They assist you in
Pure
your daily.
information.
They assist you in your daily living.
No, that ain't it. Pure information.
Tools?
One-way apps. The information goes from the app to the user and stops there. Those are the happy apps. Now let's look at the unhappy apps. Grindr, Candy Crush Saga, Facebook, WeChat, Candy Crush, Reddit, Tweetbot, Weibo, Tinder, Subway Surf, 2 Dots, Instagram, Snapchat, 1010, and Clash Royale. So what do those unhappy apps have in common? They are two-way apps. The information goes from the app to the user back to the app, and then from the app to another user, and back again. And so the information doesn't stop with you. The information gets transmitted and ultimately received in a new format. And that is stressful. That is the definition of an unhappy app. Tim Cook knows, he said, I don't mind if you want a social network. Indeed. iPhones and children, toxic pairs, say two big Apple investors, and when suckers, success is bad for society. And in fact, what was Zuckerberg's answer to this problem? I know I'm in his backyard, okay? I know that, okay? I know Priscilla really well. She was a resident at UCSF, okay? I know the story. Okay? Here's what he says. He says to boost the well-being of millions of people, to encourage users to have more conversations and connect. In other words, the cure for Facebook is more Facebook. That's Zuckerberg's answer. So the question is that right? So here's what Zuckerberg says, and he's on record for having said this. He says, people who use Facebook are depressed, but that's because they're already depressed and they're using Facebook for social validation that they can't get any other way. Now, ostensibly that is likely true for some people, that some depressed people use Facebook because they have no other way of getting social validation. The question is that true for all? And the answer is not even remotely. So if you are depressed, using Facebook for 2 weeks will make you more depressed. No argument. But if you are not depressed, Facebook will still make you more depressed. And this is timeline analysis looking at the change in time based on where you started. And basically, the average Facebook user, you'll notice there is a negative correlation, and that asterisk means it is statistically significant. So yes, if you have a depressed affect to start with, you will become more depressed, no argument, but it doesn't matter because everyone's more depressed, no matter who you are. So, Jean Twenge posed, have smartphones destroyed a generation? And she has plenty of data to argue that indeed we have. Tristan Harris, who I mentioned before, used to be the former design ethicist at Google, basically saw what was going on, brought it to the company's attention, got absolutely nowhere, and ended up with Roger McNamee, an investor here, which some of you probably know, started the Center for Humane Technology because they saw the existential threat involved in how these technologies were being utilized and what it was doing to not just children's brains, but ours. And so I'm actually an advisor to the Center for Humane Technology because I'm going to explain how technology is addictive, as I just did for you. So it's not, we're not just blowing smoke. In fact, France has a cell phone ban in schools because of this. They're doing their best to try to mitigate the damage. And when you quit Facebook, guess what? You get happier. Because there's data to say, in fact, you get happier when you quit Facebook. This is true. Okay? To the point where this is now being looked at the congressional level. Markey, SAS, Lunch, Chat, so this is a bipartisan initiative, has not yet been voted on. So if you've got congressmen, you want to call them and tell them to support the CAMERA Act, the Children and Media Research Advancement Act. Because if we're ever going to get our hands around this, it's going to be through some form of societal intervention, and that will require some form of regulation at a congressional level, because there are too many Wild West guys out there still trying to make trouble. Okay. So again, here's our model. Okay. And now we're going to take it one step further, the hacking the mind. Okay, we'll close with that. You may have read this, or you may have heard about it. This was a post, a blog from the Vice President of Membership at Facebook, Boz Bosworth, before the 2016 election, before. And here's what he said. We connect people, period. That's why all the work in growth is justified. All the questionable contact importing practices, all the subtle language that helps people stay searchable by friends. That could be bad if they make it negative. Maybe it costs a life, exposing someone to bullies. Maybe someone dies in a terrorist attack coordinated on one of our tools. The ugly truth is that we believe in connecting people so deeply that anything that allows us to connect more people more often is de facto good. It is the only area where the metrics do tell the story as far as we are concerned. Now, how do you feel about that? Knowing what you know. How do you feel about that?
The end justifies the means.
The end justifies the means, Bill says. That's right. Well, I guess the question is, what's the end?
Money.
Money. Money. It's only about money. It's only about money. The question is should that be the overriding driver of all this? In fact, here's Technology Review, okay? Our magazine. Technology is threatening our democracy. How do we save it? So what happened? Everybody know the story of Cambridge Analytica? So I'm going to tell you my way, okay? I'll tell you with the science. So, we're going to do the who, what, where, why, how, when, okay? The who is Alexander Kogan and Joseph Chancellor of Cambridge University, and also SCL, which is the parent of Cambridge Analytica. They access 270,000 Facebook users using a digital personality analysis that was sanctioned by Facebook called This Is Your Digital Life. And it gave them likes and dislikes based on this personality questionnaire. And from there, they then accessed 85 million other people associated that didn't give their permission. Okay? did was they did what Netflix does. You all have Netflix? How does Netflix know what the next movie you want to watch is? It looks at all the other movies you watch and figures out using two statistical programs known as singular value decomposition and multi-step co-occurrence. Now I'm going to tell you, I'm not a statistician. I do not know what those mean, although I can guess. Okay? So, that's about the only science that I don't have in my back pocket is the statistical analysis. But this is what they do. This is how Netflix does its job. And they did the same thing. And it turns out when you do that, you can get a pretty good, accurate assessment of who these people are. Because it distinguished 95% black from white, 93% men from women, 88% gay from straight, 85 Democrats from Republicans, and 78% based on 5 personality traits to target. So, if you've got your data anywhere on the net, and it doesn't matter if you agreed to it or not, they know who you are already. And you know that because you've heard about it in the last 2 years.
So is that coming from the answers to the questions or the fact that they know who's in your friend network?
They know because they know who's in your friend network, which, those friends didn't, agree to that. Okay? So this is, absolutely lack of informed consent. On the other hand, you put that stuff on there blindly. Okay? Now, that's the who. The what? This is really important. Who here has heard of Sam Harris? A few of you. He's a neuroscientist. He's also a philosopher and a pundit and book writer, kind of famous. He's one of the 4 horsemen of atheism, they call that. Okay? So he was very interested in what makes religious zealotry. So what he did was he took 15 devout religious zealots, and he took 15 dyed-in-the-wool atheists, and he stuck them in a scare. He read them messaging that would either conform to or detract from their worldview. Got it? And it turned out that it didn't matter if they were zealots or not, non-believers or Christians in this case. It didn't matter. When they heard a message that conformed to their personal worldview, they got a dopamine hit. And exactly the opposite messaging. So the atheists responded to atheist messaging. The devout zealots responded to devout zealot messaging. But they both got a dopamine hit. Got it? So it didn't matter which way. It's bidirectional. The point is, you get a dopamine hit because you are hearing something you identify with. So that's the what. The how, Roger wrote this book called Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe, and this really is a seminal work in piecing the whole disaster from 2016 on together. So I'm not going to bore you, and we're running out of time, but if you want to understand exactly how this all got played out, read this book. Very good. Now the where. So where did this work? Turns out you've heard that the Trump voter were the high school graduates and the Clinton voter was the college graduates. You've heard that? Yes? Okay. Turns out that's true. It's true. So here's high school or GED percentages for the country. And here's college. And you'll notice on the coast we have more college. And here's the Trump-Clinton map. And they pretty much overlap pretty darn well. And it turns out there's a reason why they overlap. So this is an analysis of the Trump versus Clinton voter based on their response to fake news versus real news. And it turns out that the Trump voter uses intuitive thinking. That's non-prefrontal cortical thinking, visceral thinking, gut thinking, lizard brain, if you will. That's been, that's a term that I didn't make that up. People make that up. And the Clinton voter, clearly more to the right, deliberative thinking, more an analytical thinking, more responsive thinking, more, taking multiple streams of information thinking rather than visceral gut thinking. Now, This is correlation, not causation. We don't know if being a, if being a deliberate thinker makes you a Democrat and being a visceral thinker makes you a Republican. We don't, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe if you're a Democrat, that's why you, or maybe, whether or not this starts early or whether this happens late, whether it can be changed or not changed. We don't know any of these things. This is just correlation, not causation. So I'm not here to tell you that I understand why any individual is in any one of these bins, other than to say these are two separate bins. They're not the same. And that the data actually support that, and the MRI data support that. And then finally, the why. So why does this make you then go vote? Whether you believe what you're voting for or not. And that has to do with the dopamine response curve. Remember dopamine? Go back to dopamine. So it turns out when you look at a standard drug response curve, what you see is you see nothing, and then you see an upswing in terms of response. And then what you see is a flattening out as you reach a shoulder. And then you get no more after that. Okay? It's called a sigma curve. That's a standard dose response curve for virtually every drug on the planet exhibits a sigma curve, except for dopamine. Dopamine is a bell-shaped curve. So there is a place on the dopamine response curve where you have optimal dopamine signal. If you are at that spot, you are fun and you are focused and you are the freaking life of the party. Okay? And if you are on the left side of the curve, you are lethargic. You can't even get out of bed. If you're on the right side of the curve, you are irritable. You are nasty. And there are things that move you along the curve in different directions. Alcohol moves you to the right. Turns out obesity moves you to the right. Estrogen can move you to the right. And we know that from doing these studies in women during different times of their ovulation cycle. Okay? That their dopamine response curve moves based on their estrogen levels. And there are certain genetic polymorphisms of the dopamine receptor that make you more or less susceptible to being on the lethargic side or the irritable side. Do you hear that, men? It's a 5 minutes joke. Okay. All right, so here we are. And, so now, these data actually show that there's an epiphenomenon that is also related to this, and it has to do with opioid use. Turns out that the opioid percentages match up with Trump support. Now, the question is it that Trump support makes you want to use opioids, or vice versa? Or is it possible that those are both epiphenomena of something else, which is called visceral thinking? Because you're only worried about today, not about tomorrow. And therefore, using an opioid will get you to where you need to go right now, without consequence about tomorrow. So I'm not in any way telling you I know why this happens, okay? Other than to say that these things do congregate together. And it's not just opioid use, it's also white nationalism. Because there's an area of the brain called the insula, okay? Also, like right next to the prefrontal cortex. It's called the insula. And the insula is the disgust center. Anybody see Inside Out? Right? What are the 5 emotions? Joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. The green lady. Okay? That's the insula. That's the insula. And so when you are disgusted, you are not happy. Okay? And disgust is its own area, and it is also tamped down by the prefrontal cortex. So when the prefrontal cortex is not working, guess what? Your xenophobia goes bonkers. And add some stress, and guess what? You get white nationalism. And Robert Sapolsky, right here from Stanford, wrote this article about this is your brain on nationalism, the biology of us versus them. We're hardwired for hate through our insults, the us versus them. Part of the limbic system that tells you if you've eaten disgusting food is also the part of your brain that tells you if your neighbor is disgusting, or, anyone else that you meet is disgusting. Responds to emotional stimuli similar to the amygdala. Activates that morally disgusting acts who's morally different than the prefrontal cortex. When it's working, inhibits it, which is how we all get along in life, except when it's not working. The cortex decides who's an in-group member and who's not. So there's the them, the fear, the aggression, the disgust, all the insula, and empathy is suppressed. Autocrats activate your insular cortex and suppress your PFC. And humans belong to multiple groups, so it's us versus them in whatever format you want to look at. So this now leads us to the hacking of the mind. So I'm going to ask you a question. What is the difference between marketing and propaganda? Anyone want to venture a thought?
Marketing is more one way, and propaganda has a cycle back through as a feedback loop.
No.
Propaganda is from governments, while marketing is from other sources that aren't centralized.
No.
Marketing is what we do, propaganda is what other people do.
Good. I like that. There's some truth to that, like the difference between our rebellion and their rebellion, like Benjamin Franklin said. Yes. Any others? Good, but not quite. Almost, but not quite. Yeah.
Marketing is ideas about products and services. Propaganda is mostly about people's attitude towards people and ideas, social ideas.
No.
Marketing is tied to greed.
No, propaganda is tied to greed too. Any others?
Propaganda requires a third-party judgment.
No. Go ahead, Alex.
So does marketing?
I hope he gets it right.
Marketing is basically something you do for a reward, and like propaganda is something just so you feel that everybody else is agrees with you, or something like that.
No, they're both a reward. Yeah.
Marketing, you know it's marketing. Propaganda, you may not even know that it's propaganda.
No, because marketing is often not realized either. Go ahead, Bill. This is fun.
So propaganda was argumentation based largely on emotion.
No. Go ahead, Jesse.
Marketing is about want, propaganda is about hate.
No, not exactly. No. Go ahead.
Marketing uses facts and propaganda uses emotion.
Thank you! Oh! Excellent. That's right.
You know, the marketing I know.
Marketing is using information to espouse your point of view, whatever it is.
Even if it's false information.
I would argue
No, propaganda is using disinformation to espouse your point of view. So when companies or government tell you the truth, they're marketing. When they tell you a lie, it's propaganda. That's the difference between marketing and propaganda. Propaganda is the truth. Now, we're allowed to market. Everyone's allowed to market. Problem is we're also allowed to propagandize. And the reason we're allowed to propagandize is because the Supreme Court said so. In 1980, Central Hudson Gas and Electric versus Public Service Commission, a 5-4 decision that basically established the rules for commercial speech. There are none. They can say whatever the hell they want, and you can't sue them for it because they're allowed. The Central Hudson said so. 5-4. As far as I'm concerned, this is when things went down the tubes. Because now it is fake news, and they're allowed to be as fake as they want. Because the Supreme Court said so. This is the problem. So in summary, technology has an upside as an educational tool, but a downside is an interactive entertainment or unfiltered social media. Behavioral addictions are like drug addictions. They use the exact same pathway with the exact same neurotransmitter. There's still dopamine downregulation of its own receptor and nucleus accumbens, and reduced inhibition by the prefrontal cortex, usually due to stress. Tolerance and dependence instead of tolerance and withdrawal. But because there are no systemic effects, there's no withdrawal. Children are most susceptible because of their underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, because that's the last part of the brain to myelinate. Facebook and other social media take advantage of variable reward and likes to drive distraction. And propaganda drives dopamine and stress, likely responsible for the hacking of people's B.Scs and driving altered behavior. So, Zuckerberg says Facebook is pivoting to privacy after years of controversies. In fact, if you actually look at what they're proposing, there's no privacy. It's still the same. Roger actually put together a legislative agenda for Congress back in Washington Monthly a year ago. And here's what he suggested we do about this. Ban digital bots that impersonate humans, no acquisition until damage is addressed. Transparency about political and issues-based communication, transparency about algorithms, offer a legitimate opt-out, statute of limitations on the use of consumer data. Consumers, not platforms, should own their own data, and antitrust legislation should be specific to the internet, which we do not have right now. I would actually like to add a ninth, ban anonymous. That is the single worst thing. If you were in the public square and you have something to say, everyone knows who you are. And you know what? Your prefrontal cortex keeps you from saying it if it's dangerous or hateful. But when you're anonymous, you say the thing damn well how you want. And that is the most dangerous. Yeah.
This was about children. You just underscored the purpose of addicting children, then they remain addicted as adults.
Of course.
That's where it goes.
Absolutely. Right?
Very clear.
I think so. Thank you. And in the UK, they are about to regulate Zuckerberg. Hooray! Facebook needs regulation as Zuckerberg fails, say the UK MPs. So I want to introduce you all to the Center for Humane Technology. If you don't know about it yet, you should. Here's the board, and there's some heavy hitters on there. Okay? Asa Raskin is the son of Jeff Raskin, who invented the Macintosh. Okay? Roger, who was a mentor to Zuckerberg, he's the one who told Zuckerberg not to sell to Yahoo for $1 billion back in 2006. Randy Fernando from NVIDIA, Renee DeRessa, who's amazing. Their advisors, there I am, okay, and a bunch of other people who are pretty smart too. We're developing a ledger of harms and a developer's coder's code of ethics, and we are pushing for an FDA for technology. So with that, I'm going to close, and I'm happy to answer all of your questions. I hope that I have given you at least some sense about that word in our title, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Okay, it's not an automatic, that is good. It depends what you do with it, and that's up to all of us. Thank you.
Just one comment. While we generally don't do we don't do book programs per se. I did get from Kepler's about a half dozen copy of this book, which I have read, and quite a good working knowledge for a beginner of sort of some neurotransmitters and things. My wife in the back will stand up. She has the books if you're interested in getting.
And I'll be happy to sign if you buy them. Here.
Yeah, I, along with my husband, we go to the jail and work on people that are about to be released from jail, and it's my hope that they won't agree.
Be recidivists, yeah.
And most of them have addictions, I'd say almost all.
Absolutely.
And you depress the hell out of me over what we can do. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, so, if you're addicted, you got a problem. The goal is to not get there. Once you're addicted, the goal is get the dopamine down so that the receptors can come back. The problem is, if you're addicted, those neurons, some of them at least, are dead. And if they're dead, they're going to be they're not coming back. So those people are going to have an altered amplitude of reward and reinforcement for the rest of their lives. They're never going to feel the same. And the earlier they figure that out and get used to it, the better off they'll be. But, having said that, reward is what gets you out of bed in the morning. That's the survival of the species. And ultimately, dopamine doesn't care if you're dead. The species doesn't care if you die. They just need to propagate the species. So, it's ultimately, the biological imperative against your own, your own personal imperative. Yeah.
If someone is younger, so say I have a friend who has a son who's 15, they just sent away for 3 months because of addictions. When you're younger like that, do you have a better opportunity for those neurons to still have survived, or does it just depend on the severity?
Depends on the severity, but in fact, the data suggests that the adolescent who's addicted actually does worse. Yeah.
So I hope I'm not going down too much of a rabbit hole here, but you talked about how dopamine in adolescents, like especially, drugs like that. Okay, so we have been prescribing stimulants like Ritalin, amphetamines, dexamphetamine, all of that to our children and adolescents. And do you think that has played a part in this addiction problem that we're seeing in addition to the things that you discussed?
Yeah, so the question is, the fact that we're treating all these kids with Ritalin and all these stimulants, is that actually contributing to the addictive process? That's a hard question because they're already distracted, so maybe they would have gone that way anyway because distraction automatically means decreased prefrontal cortical effects, because that's what the prefrontal cortex does, is tamp that down. So was that problem and the reason for their addiction there before they ever started the meds? Or is it an additive effect of the meds on top of it? In addition, most of those are not dopamine agonists, they are norepi agonists. So different receptor, different neuron, different reason. So I have not seen any data that says that Ritalin's contributing to it. However, Ritalin use is a marker for the distracted brain, which is more likely to end up addicted in the first place. So is it a phenomenon or an epiphenomenon? We don't know that.
I have a strange question, but anyway, there are some activities like art, music, and other quite creative processes which are very addictive,
Yes.
especially.
Well, they're not addictive.
So
They're
yeah, what's
serotonin
the
generating.
I mean, they
Art
are
music.
generating reward, and some people are highly susceptible, and they are building their life around
Yeah.
it. How
So-
that's different?
So first of all, there's nothing wrong with a little reward, okay? I'm not anti-reward, okay? And you can have reward and contentment at the same time. So, for instance, playing a musical instrument in a symphony on stage with a bunch of, with an audience, that'll give you dopamine and serotonin at the same time, okay? Being on the US women's soccer team will get you dopamine and serotonin at the same time. We call it rapture, okay? When you get both at the same time, and sometimes the emotions are so amazingly strong that you cry. You're so joyous, you cry, okay? And that's because of both pathways being activated at the same time. So there's nothing wrong with that. But all of those are short-lived. The dopamine will go down. So it's okay to do those things, and it's okay to play wonderful music, and it's okay to be in a soccer match, and it's okay to, generate, your dopamine / serotonin through whatever pathway you want. And I'm totally for it. Okay? It's the chronic effect that gets you into trouble, not the acute. Okay? And all of these are bouts of acute rather than chronic. Neurons like to be tickled, not bludgeoned, and they like to go back to rest. And they will.
It's great.
Go ahead.
You said you would touch on multitasking. We have a granddaughter who insists that she can do 4 or 5 things at the same time.
Well, maybe she can. 2.5% of the population can. Is she one of them? The ultimate multitaskers are pilots. Pilots are the ultimate. They gravitate toward being pilots because they are multitaskers, because they can do 5, 6 things at once. Now, if you stick a pilot in a scanner and you start giving them extra tasks to do, there will come a point when they will end up with a cortisol rise, and they will become totally distracted, and all of their tasks will fall apart. So even the pilot can't do it all. Okay? They just have a higher threshold before they fail than the rest of us mere mortals. Okay? But everyone has a threshold. What that threshold is for you, you know, the only way to know is to find out. Yeah.
I am curious in like, is there anything for the kids that we can expose them to social media, which is like just enough for them, or we can just have like put it all.
So what can we do about it? Right? What can we do about it? And the answer is, I don't know yet. I don't know yet. I'm very worried about it, and I want to do something about it, but you know, I'm not sure what to do either. I've written a grant to the French government to actually study this in prepubertal children in France. And we have two modalities that we want to try. One is my colleague at UCSF, Adam Ghazali. Are any of you familiar with him? You are in the back. Okay. So he's a neuroscientist, neuroimager. He's working with a group at UCSF on distractibility and ADD. And he has developed a video game to combat video games. Because kids will play video games. Okay, but in fact, what this does is it doesn't distract him. Actually, it forces you to focus. And he's got data that says it works, and he's actually applied to the FDA for approval for the first non-pharmacologic treatment for ADD, because it strengthens the prefrontal cortex. And he knows that because he can measure it. What we want to do in this grant is take his video game and see if we can alter emotional lability as well as distractibility, based on the same concept of prefrontal cortical resilience, increasing that. So that's one modality that we're going to try if we get the grant. Second is, what if we teach kids early deliberative reasoning? The earlier, the better, right? And we at MIT believe in deliberative reasoning. This is our thing, as it were. Okay. Why don't we teach 5-year-olds the scientific method? You can do it. Can be done.
They're pre-watching.
Huh?
They're pre-watching.
No, they're not.
They can do. Yeah, I tried to do something like this with my daughter, and it's very impressive. They can learn really fast. The main problem, though, that she consumes information very fast, and she keep asking me questions. So the problem was in me and in my child, because she was developing fast, and without questions answered, she got stuck. So when you want to develop kids faster, then you need different parents. Or
yeah, you may need different parents.
Well, the question is, if you did it in school, would it make a difference?
So
The point is, we'll have pre-post. We're not going to do MRI scans
because you know kids won't sit still in the scanner, but we can do a lot of intellectual and cognitive and behavioral and emotional analysis. So those are the two modalities we want to assess, and I'm waiting to hear if we get the grant. Yeah.
My question is about directions, because the amount of entertainments is because it's quite easy for young teams of developers and game designers to develop a successful game, got money, got reputation, got career opportunities, so they are seeing that's very viral, that's addictive, they are producing that.
Yeah.
But if, so they don't know how to create something which generate money and reputation without using addictive.
So that's why we want the Coder's Code of Ethics for this reason, is because we want developers of various technologies to have the client, the patient, the human at the core of what they do, as opposed to the company at the core of what they do.
But when they are starting and they are young and ambitious.
Yeah, I know. I got it. It ain't easy.
Let's do one more.
One more. Okay. Matt.
What is your unit of depression, or how are you measuring depression?
In which study? What are you talking about? In which one? I mean, different people measure in different ways. Usually it's measured with the SF-36. It's a standardized questionnaire that's usually used for depression.
Well, thank you. Just my partner in this is Afsana, and she sent a note about a couple of future events she wanted to tell the audience, but we still have you captive.
Great. Well, first, I'd like to give a special thank you. Should I use the mic?
Yeah,
Okay,
yes.
all right. Well, first, I'd like to give a very special thank you to Dr. Lustig. This is an accessory for your brass rack.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it goes very well together with it.
Of course.
And it's really an honor to have you speak
No,
to
it's
us.
it's always my pleasure.
And enlighten us, and the fact that you're an MIT alum makes it very, very special. So thank you.
I'm always here for you guys.
Thank you. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our hosts today, WSGR. Thanks for the venue and the food and all that. And thank you to William. William really thought of this event, organized this event, keeps very close track of all of your research and makes sure that we, the MIT community here, are up to speed on it. I do want to announce a couple of other exciting events that are coming up and being hosted by the MIT Club of Northern California. This was brought to you by the Healthcare Forum, and our next event, we take a little bit of break in the summer, so our next event is actually on Wednesday, October 16th, and it's on a slightly related event, so it's actually about adolescent health, and the topic is smoke, sex, and substances in teens and young adults. So we will be looking at substance abuse, particularly around vaping and all of the controversy around that. And that'll be hosted at the AbbVie office in Redwood City. So even though it's in October, please keep an eye open for that, and we hope you'll join us. There are a few other events that are kind of club-wide that are very exciting in the fall. So the first is we have our annual meeting in late August, on August 25th, and it's free for all members of the club. And it's actually, I think, a member-only event, so great opportunity to become a member if you aren't one. It's being hosted at the USS Hornet Museum in Alameda, California, and there will be some recreational aspects to it, plus some club administrative activities going on. On September 14th, we have the annual AI conference, Artificial Intelligence Conference. The topic this year is the future of computing, and it's being held in Palo Alto. Usually it's a full-day event. Last year we had over 900 attendees. It was a very successful event, so invite you to join us there. And then last but not least, a really fun social event that happens annually too. It's the Spotlight event. It's being held at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco, and it's a gala event, so we dress up, we have a sit-down dinner, there's a dance party after, and there is a guest speaker. So this year it's Patrick Collison, if I'm saying his name right, and he is the founder and CEO of Stripe. So some great events coming up in the fall. We hope you will join us, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening and making it special. So have a great